A video I've wanted to make for as long as I can remember has always been the history of the characters in Dead Rising, and it's something that many of you have been waiting to see as well. However, I've continuously neglected making this video because I felt there wasn't enough information known to actually make the video worthwhile. But a lot of time has passed, and myself and the community have had the time to properly data mine beta assets and research early prototype files from the game. And I think we've amassed an encyclopedia of information on this topic, and it's about time I make this video. Within this video, we'll discuss the mass array of differences that the characters within the game have gone through from 2005 to 2006. Those changes being that of their physical appearance and, in some cases, even their names. All of the changes you'll see today are what crafted the final game's cast of characters. You'll also see a lot of removed or simply unused characters from the game, many of which we don't at all know the origins of. We have a lot to get through, so I'll just save the long introduction for another video, and let's just get right into this. Now, to start things off, let's just get through the easiest part of all of this, the character name differences. Now, this will include name changes as well as names that simply go unused in the game. We've been able to dig up these names in earlier pre-release builds of the game by finding font-related files containing numerous changes in the names of characters. Now, our main protagonists within the story haven't actually had their names changed throughout development. Brad was always Brad, Jessie was always Jessie. You get the idea. But the survivors and bosses within the game have gone through quite a few changes. For instance, David Garrison would eventually be changed to David Bailey. Thomas Steedmore became Wayne Blackwell. Jack Swanson would become the infamous Kent Swanson, and Mark Olton would later be Nathan Crabb. Capcom carried the Jack Swanson name for quite a while throughout development, as even the pictures that Kent shows you on his camera are all still internally labeled Jack. Now, two characters that originally never received a name because they were characters that never actually got used in the game to begin with were Calvin Philpott and Robin Bowers. Now, not much is known on these two deceased characters, but it's likely they would have originally been used in the background of the cult leader boss battle, perhaps as two people who were sacrificed and killed. Their model and textures still exist in the game's files today, just of course go totally unused. Now, as you would expect, there's also some names that we have been able to dig up for characters that simply do not exist anymore, and here is a list of those in question. Now, whether these were names for survivors or psychopaths, we don't really know. They were just included in a large list of names from the beta. There is also characters seen in earlier trailers and demo builds of the game, such as Tokyo Game Show 2005, that were mostly recycled into characters we know today, but their names have changed tremendously. Those being Rachel, Alan, Kathy, and Freddy, and the newly discovered Kent. Now, Rachel from this demo build would end up making it into the final game, being recycled and used as the woman attacked beside her car that Frank observes from the monitor, just with different hair. Alan from this demo would be recycled into Ryan LaRosa in the final game, and Kathy would become Lindsay Harris. Now, this Freddy character would be removed from the game entirely, although parts of his model would be used for other things down the road. And lastly, we have Kent, who would eventually be recycled into Brett Stiles with some pretty drastic changes done to his appearance as well. In fact, within that list of unused names we mentioned, Kent Erickson could have been the full name of the Kent character we saw in the TGS demo, but who knows? Also, in a later 2006 build of the game, Aaron would use David's model and name, and David would use Aaron's model and name. Now, I'm not exactly sure why, but technically speaking, this would have originally been Aaron, and this would have originally been David. They simply swapped these characters around at the last minute of development, and maybe that's a good thing, but it's cool to see that this was their original idea for these two characters. Now, as far as different and unused names go, this is all we have. but we've only just scratched the surface of the development history of these characters. Now let's check out the physical differences between the cast, as well as of course some completely unused and previously never before seen characters. Now first up, we have the beta version of Natalie Mayer. Now her original model here was actually the exact same one that can be seen within the E3 2005 trailer. And also, as an interesting side note, her E3 model was actually a human version of a cutscene zombie seen within the prologue of the game. Just an interesting fact. Alongside this early E3 Natalie model, there was also footage of an unknown woman following Frank in the supermarket seen in the E3 2005 trailer. Her name will never be known, but fortunately we were able to data mine her model and textures from a 2006 beta build of the game. It's easily one of the lowest detailed characters in the game, which makes sense as her model was likely a placeholder for the E3 demo. There was also various test versions of her with Japanese text written onto her shirt, and as of right now, we don't have any way to assign these textures to her original beta model. So the best we can do is show the exported model with the textures on the side. Next we have Gordon Stallworth's original 2005 model. Now unlike Natalie and that other woman from E3, this early Gordon model was never actually shown to us in any promotional material of the game. His model was intended to be used in the E3 demo as NPC3, but for some reason that didn't end up happening. This model cannot be seen anywhere in the trailer. However, thanks to data mining, we were able to find the character, and here it is. A model we were never supposed to see. Now again, this is actually a human version of a zombie. The zombie in question being that blue sweater zombie seen in E3 2005. As you can see, they simply created a human version, likely because at the time, it was easier to recycle zombies into survivors, or vice versa, rather than to create entirely new characters. This is the same case that we described with Natalie, being that her model was simply an alternate version of a zombie. Things are kind of different today in the final game of Dead Rising, where survivors in the game don't really resemble any zombie model in the game. This is because they had the time to create totally new survivor assets and totally new zombie assets. Another survivor model that is completely and utterly unknown is a prototype model with the file name of NPC7, and they were even kind enough to write that onto his shirt, in case you forgot. Now since the survivor was only used in 2005 and never saw the light of day in the final game, there isn't much to say about it, other than the interesting fact that the face texture is a human version of another zombie from E3 2005. Again, this shows you that they were constantly recycling zombies into survivors and vice versa. I don't actually have the model for this character, only the textures were found in the beta, but I was able to find a model in the final game that closely resembles this beta character, so that the textures could fit onto it. And aside from the shirt, the textures fit pretty well. The text on the shirt just isn't aligned correctly, so it's probably not the exact shirt model. Connie from the game's prologue went through some pretty drastic changes, not so much in her model, but with the quality and design of her textures. We've been able to find multiple versions of Connie through 2005 and 2006, so we can see the progression her textures have gone through. It's obviously a good thing Capcom went back a few times to perfect the textures for her, because she looked like an ogre in 2005. Lindsay Harris from the intro of the game, once originally called Kathy, had a really early version of her textures back in 2005. And while they were the same color palette, her shirt was missing all the flower details. Now what's interesting is that this model of her predates the Kathy we saw in the TGS demo, as in that version, Kathy was visually identical to the final version of Lindsay we know today. So this model of her was likely from earlier in 2005, though it's hard to say exactly when this version of her was used. Now that brings us to a character that is actually still called Kathy in the game today, and while not an important character and merely only an intro survivor, Kathy has gone through some interesting changes. Her model has not noticeably changed, but she was originally wearing a much more colorful shirt and with green pants, rather than whatever color you call this. Now this is interesting because it shows that despite these characters being only used for a brief part of the game, Capcom still made changes to these survivors throughout development. And if we continue on with intro survivors, while we're on that topic, one other interesting change was the characters they chose to use in the helicopter intro. And while this isn't a change in a character's physical appearance, in an older version of the game, they were originally using Aaron as the man being attacked on the car, rather than Rich. And also the woman firing the gun on the rooftop was originally Leah, rather than Michelle. Again, this isn't a huge difference, but important to note nonetheless, while we're here. Now there's quite a few more survivors that underwent some changes, but the majority of those changes is very hard to notice, and usually only involves a slight change of a shirt color or a change in their skin tone, an example of which being Rachel or Chris from the intro, even Barnaby. But we won't focus on those too much, as nearly all survivors in the game underwent minimal changes like this. So I decided to stick to the most important ones, and now we'll just move on. So, now that we're done with survivors, as we've definitely covered the most interesting differences, let's move on to the main characters of the game now. Of course, the history of Frank is well known by now and almost doesn't need to be in this video, but I'll include it anyway for the sake of completion. The earliest model of Frank known to exist is of course his E3 2005 model, and while I've been able to data mine the jacket and shirt models from that version of Frank, I've not been able to find the full E3 model. It's unfortunately lost in time. However, by some miracle, I've been able to dig up his later TGS 2005 model, and while that version of Frank is about 4 months newer than the E3 version, it's still incredibly early as he was still sporting his original turtleneck sweater. Now of course, once 2006 rolled by, Capcom had started to change Frank's appearance many times, and while certainly not as interesting as the 2005 versions of him, I was of course able to find the full early 2006 beta version of Frank, as well as some other obscure assets here and there, such as a slightly different version of his final hair model, for some reason. There's a lot of stuff going on with Frank, it's kinda hard to cover it all. Now, Jessie's earliest beta model from 2005 is again sadly missing. However, I was able to find her face and clothing textures, and as we discussed before, you can see how rough the aesthetic of textures was from 2005. Jessie's earliest face texture looks like a vampire. It's horrifying. Now, oddly, there was a later version of Jessie from a trailer of the game in 2005, which showed her wearing a more brown-colored outfit, but those textures are nowhere to be found. They were likely only used for a short period of time, and those textures are now long gone. Brad's earliest model is by far one of the most interesting. The model they used is a placeholder character model, and it's a model we'll actually see again later in the video for another character. Now, I'm not sure where Capcom got this model from. Maybe it was from one of their older games, I have no idea. Concept art would suggest Brad's overall design was mostly figured out even in 2005. So apart from his early prototype model, there isn't much to say about Brad's appearance changes, because he didn't really go through many changes. In earlier 2006 builds of the game, his shirt was originally a brighter shade of yellow. I know, riveting, isn't it? But apart from that, Brad really hasn't changed much. On the other hand, Isabella has had quite a lengthy development timeline. Her earliest design, or at least the earliest design I've been able to find, shows her with a much darker skin tone, and with different hair. In fact, these textures are nearly identical to the ones that were seen in the TGS 2005 trailer. Later on in 2006, Isabella went through various different skin tones and face textures, only to eventually land on her finalized version. During development, her early models encountered constant issues with the hair movement, and it got so bad that in one build of the game, her hair didn't move at all, and was welded to her head. And well, her facial expressions weren't even working either. Isabella is definitely a character that the developers definitely spent a lot of time trying to understand, and this is visible by how many times they changed her model. Karlito too has seen an extremely diverse appearance alteration during the development of this game. Karlito's oldest model and textures technically resemble how he looks in the final game, he just appears to be more cartoonish. His face is completely different, and his hair is slicked back rather than the unkempt look he has in the final game. His jacket color was a bright red color, which really stood out, and he was also noticeably taller for some reason. One thing that's really cool about this beta version of Karlito is that the model almost perfectly matches the concept art of him, which in my opinion is cool as hell. There's not many characters that look like their concept art. The beta version of Otis isn't incredibly different aside from the fact that in 2005, Otis was like 150 years old or something. We don't really know the date or era of this version of Otis, but the textures are certainly from 2005. It's very likely Otis would have a different model as well back in the early days of development, but I wasn't able to find one. Luckily, these 2005 textures of him apply directly onto his final model, so we can at least see how he looked. Ed Deluca, the helicopter pilot, has had a rather unusual development history. For some reason, Ed's assets originally started out life as a zombie. This zombie had never been shown in any promotional material for the game and was clearly a placeholder zombie for cutscenes. And for reasons totally unknown, this zombie's face texture would eventually be recycled into Ed's face texture. The only reason we know this is because included with this zombie was an extra face texture in the folder, which is of a human skin tone. Now, it took me a long time to figure this out, but that human face texture applies directly to the final model of Ed, sharing nearly the exact same texture UV. I'm not quite sure what this zombie was or why Ed's development originated from it, but it's definitely some cool history. Now, aside from this extremely early face texture, Ed's clothing and hair wasn't actually any different from his final version. However, he did sport some gold aviators rather than the black ones he has in the final game. But that's just a tiny detail, obviously. And now finally, with protagonists out of the way, let's move on to the changes of the bosses and psychopaths. There isn't too many to mention, and we'll just stick to the most important ones. The first most jarring difference has to be with Brock Mason, as originally Brock had hair. The rest of Brock's textures haven't changed at all, surprisingly, just his head. His face is slightly different too, and they even scanned a completely different actor for this face texture. He also didn't have any scars on his face, which obviously didn't make him look as badass and battle-hardened. It was definitely a shock the first time I found this model of Brock, to say the least. Next, we have a completely unused psychopath or boss. We have no idea what his name would have been, but the file is called EM42, so we'll call him that. You may notice he's actually using the same model as that prototype version of Brad, except the skin tone is now white and has a different colored outfit. One bizarre difference between this and the Brad model is this addition of an Illuminati symbol stuck onto his forehead. I shit you not. I have no idea what this is meant to symbolize or if the developers were just fooling around. After all, nobody was ever supposed to see this model. Some people in the community have theorized that this may be a prototype model of Sean, the cult leader, but the file name of the model simply doesn't match up, so we can't say for sure. People have also said it might be a prototype model of Frank, but again, there's no evidence to suggest that. It's definitely one of the weirder characters we've seen today, and by far the most bizarre character in the history of Dead Rising. And also, there was another completely unused psychopath or boss. This one internally named EM53. Again, no actual name can be associated with this character, and we have no idea who or what this character was. He seems to be sporting something similar to an Adidas tracksuit, and oddly looks like a very early version of Karlito, but the file name doesn't match up, so it's probably just a coincidence. We'll never know the origins of these two unused characters, but if you have any ideas, by all means, write them down in the comments below. And that is it. Now again, there is characters and bosses in Dead Rising with changes throughout their development history that I have purposely skipped over. The reason for this is the majority of those character changes simply consist of a brightness or saturation difference in their textures, which isn't at all worth mentioning. So in this video we stuck to only the most important and visually different characters, but hopefully this gives you some definitive insight into the changes of your favorite Dead Rising characters. I'll take this time to mention that I'll always have more in-depth information about Dead Rising's history on the forum compared to in a video. So if you would like to read up on all the changes of Dead Rising, there will always be a link down below in the description for the forum, as well as a link to our Dead Rising Discord server, where we are literally always talking about this sort of stuff. I may not always be making videos, but I'm definitely always talking about Dead Rising in the Discord server. So if you're into that, check the links down below. Thanks for watching, and as always, subscribe for more.